Greetings, greetings, my brothers and sisters, heirs, joint heirs, adopted, grafted, natural, spiritual. I hope that this video finds you well. It's a overcast, but yet sunny, typical warm day in South Florida. Driving home, decided to stop at our favorite place and get some fish, whole snapper. But I'm sitting there and gives me an opportunity to kind of write down notes as I'm going to line up this. I decided that this week I've got the subject that I'm going to go with. Last night I was watching what happened in Atlanta and watched that for quite a bit. And of course, yesterday there was the subject I did on the lesson pertaining to positioning ourselves for demonstration. So as I was sitting there eating, I came up with the subject that I want to use for the tone of this week. And that's going to be suffering for Christ versus suffering for sin. Suffering for Christ versus suffering for sin. And let me tell you why I was sitting there and I got a nice little comment from one of the viewers from yesterday's message. And the comment brought a subject on the table that I thought was very worthy to take into consideration. And the conversation was that whenever we go through something, I made the comment that whenever we go through something, we need to take a look at the mirror, look at ourselves, and see what's going on. And the viewer said, Pastor, I'm a little curious because when we go through things, why do we have to look at ourselves when we know that the disciples were told that they were going to go through many things? And my response was, yeah, you are right. However, Daniel, when he did not get his answer, he went into prayer and he started to ask for forgiveness for the sins of Israel and himself. But that was a valid point that the viewer had made, that do we always look at ourselves amid what's going on in the world today, knowing that we're going to go through stuff? And as I was sitting there and I said, I need to evaluate this because that's a good subject, but I need to evaluate it and look at it from all angles. And one of the things I do as a teacher, I try to step out and in, out of the subject and then step back into the subject. When you do that, it allows you to see the subject and the topic in the direction that it may go. So you have to be in the subject, but you also have to step out of the subject and look at what's being presented on the table. And I did that. And I came to the conclusion of going in and out of the subject, in and out of the subject. I quickly realized, there's a difference between suffering for Christ and suffering. There's a huge difference. They're on two different ends of the spectrum. I mean, really, two different ends of the spectrum. If my, don't be alarmed, I'll just pick it up and put it back on. But I'm safe driving with my hands on the wheel. So they're on two different ends of the spectrum, two different ends. Israel is suffering because of sin. Not all. Most people, there's two reasons why you could be suffering. You could be suffering for the name of Christ's sake, or you could be suffering because of sin. We can go through things because of the sin. These are what we call the repercussions of the acts of sin. And the repercussions for the acts of sin, you will suffer those things, but that is totally different from suffering for Christ's sake. The Messiah says, many shall hate you for my name's sake. Many shall hate you because of that. Okay? That's different from suffering because of sin. So, everything that we go through, and when we see these societal sufferings that the world is going through, and when we see the incidents in Atlanta, Minnesota, and we can just keep naming cities all over the place, Louisville, New York, I mean, it just goes on. Then there's so many names that has taken place since this pandemic that it's just more fuel put on the fire. But we as a people cannot say that that is suffering for Christ. It's not. I'm not saying that it's justified. I'm not saying that it's right. I'm not saying that it's something that we don't look at. We can pinpoint it. These things that are happening, it's because of other things, but it's simply not because we are for the name of Christ's sake. Certainly not. Certainly not. At all. So we're going to talk about that this week. I'm not going to get deep into it now, because I'm going to put out a lot of scriptures that talks about when we suffer for Christ and when we suffer for sin. And then we're going to evaluate those things. And then we're going to, as we come up out of the subject, we're going to look at what's going on in the world today. And then we're going to ask the question, is this because the suffering's for Christ's sake, or is this suffering because of sin's sake? And we need to ask that question. Those are the questions that we're going to ask once we step out of the tone of this week's lessons. So tune in. We're going to be hitting this every night. Every night we're going to be hitting this week. And that's going to be the theme for this week. Suffering for the sake of Christ versus the suffering for because of sin. That's going to be our tone all week long. We're going to identify it. We're going to dissect it. We're going to determine, are they one and the same? And of course, we know that they're not, but we need to bring that out. Because what happens is, if we're suffering for Christ's sake, we can't say that we did something wrong. And if we're suffering because of sin, we can't say that we're suffering because we're believers. So we need to look at that. We need to examine that and put that on the table. Tomorrow night, we're going to have Brother Will from the Israel of God. He's going to be bringing a lesson. He's put together a very, very good lesson. A very good lesson that is relevant to this subject and to what's going on. So Brother Will is going to be on. He's going to be our guest tomorrow night at 8 o'clock Eastern Time. And he's going to be bringing forth that lesson. And I'm looking forward to it. He's a young man, a very good reader, very good teacher, very enthused for the word, out of Chicago. And he's going to be our presenter tomorrow night, live tomorrow night. And we're going to be picking it up the rest of the week. The suffering of Christ versus the suffering for sin. So tune in. We're gonna look at that. But in the meantime, it's just a shame what happened in Atlanta. It's a shame what happened. It's more fuel that's thrown on an already well-lit fire. An already well-lit fire. There's going to be reform because all people are involved. All people are involved. So we don't need to be a prophet to know that something's going to happen. And a lot of people are going to jump on this. See, I told you this was going to happen. That's going to happen. History will let you know that whenever all ethnic groups join in for a cause, there is always a change. I'm going to be bringing in some documentaries that I'm going to be preparing, and because people kind of forget what happened in 1963. Some of my followers and subscribers wasn't even born in 1963. Wasn't even born. And so the association of what's going on today, they can't even fathom that. And to read it in the history book, because it was considered in the history book, like all history, a lot of people are just not interested in history. It's about the current events of what's happening today. So history can repeat itself, and to you that's experiencing it, it's like it's never happened before. It's never happened before. And I think history, I've learned to appreciate history because history repeats itself based upon history. Historically, history repeats itself. And that's where that phrase comes from. History repeats itself, because if you look at what has happened in the past and the aftermath of whatever has happened, the same thing happens again. So hence the phrase, history repeats itself. Just like the Spanish flu in 1920, the bubonic plague of 1820. Every 100 years, there is a pandemic plague. Every 100 years. And it kills a lot of people. And it's usually the second wave that does the damage. And in this coronavirus, I don't know how many people are going to die the second wave, but we do know roughly about 10% of the people that contract the virus, about 10% of those individuals die. In America, what you're going to find out of the 10% of the people that die who catch this plague, you're going to find out that probably 65% that die will be people of color. That's what you're going to find. Although people of color are only maybe 8 to 10% of the people that are contracting the virus. 8 to 10% of the people that are contracting the virus are people of color. Yet, out of everybody that dies, about 65% will be the would be that 8 to 10% of people of color. Something's wrong there. Something's wrong there. Those are statistics that you cannot ignore. Okay, you cannot ignore those statistics and not take a look at it and try to figure out what is going on. Now, most people say, well, we know what's going on. Out of the 10% of the people that die from the plague, the people that are dying have underlying conditions. And so what you're going to say is that the 12% of the population is the most unhealthiest group of people in the United States. So now you got to go back and look at that too. You got to go back and look at that. Why is that? Why is 12% of your population 60 or 70% of the most unhealthy people in your population group? So give you an example of that. Let's just take 100 people. If people of color are, out of 100 people, are 15 people, okay? And the rest are 85 of your group. And let's say out of that 100, let's say 10 people get sick. If 7 of the 10 come from the 15%, and I'm using that as a high number of your population, something's wrong. Something's wrong. It should reflect the demographics. Statistics should reflect, if it's all equal, if it's balanced, statistics should match the same general makeup of your samples. That's what it should be. It should match the same makeup of your samples. So if out of 100, if 15% are people of color and 85% is other, then when it comes to 10 people getting sick, at least 2 should only be people of color. The other 8 should be the other. It can't be flip-flop. It can't be 8 of the people are people of color and 2 reflect your 80%. Something's wrong there. Something is wrong. It shows disparity someplace, whether it's disparate treatment, disparate services. Something is wrong with that. And whenever you take somebody to court for discrimination, if you can show disparate treatment, then you're going to win the case. It's just the way the Supreme Court works. A lot of times these cases got to go up to the Supreme Court. And it's the Supreme Court that does not ignore statistical data. And they're going to say, well, wait a minute, something's wrong here. Your records reflect that there is disparate treatment. So therefore, we're going to award the plaintiff these funds, because that's what they call systemic racism. Systemic means the system, pertaining to the system. And it may not be intentional. It could be just, these are the systems that are put in place. And that's why they call it systemic racism and not racism that is intended by the user. The user is simply using the system to carry out whatever they carry out. But if the system is racist, then it don't matter what you do. It don't matter who the end user is. The outcome is still going to be the same. That's what systemic racism is. You know, and everything is not equal. And we know everything is not equal. In fact, people of other groups have come to the reality that this is not just coincidence. It's not coincidence. So therefore, it's a legitimate cause. When everybody of your sample group jumps in on the cause, that is what legitimizes your cause. It's just it. So let me use that for an example. Okay, so if only 15% of your population is complaining that the coffee is not any good, or if they complaining that the bread is spoiled and nobody else is, well, guess what? You just complaining. That's how everybody gonna look at it. You just complaining. Something's wrong with your taste buds. Nobody else is complaining but you. And generally, that's what happens. That's generally the case. But at the same time, on the other hand, if everybody from all sample groups start to complain, then it legitimizes the complaint, and therefore things get changed, things get done. And somebody will throw out the bread. Somebody will put on a different cup, a different pot of coffee, because it's been legitimized. It's not just one group crying about it. So there will be some reform. I think that reform is not needed. You just need to enforce the rules that are already there on the books. And that's all you need to do. And politicians know that there are already certain rules and procedures and training put on the book, but they have never enforced it. So the hypocrisy of politicians is that they will change the name. They'll take the same book and put a different title on it and say that they created reform. But let me tell you something, if it's not enforced, if it's not looked at, then it doesn't make any difference. Me, just look at what's already on the records, look at what's already on the books, and start enforcing it. But that's not what the politicians are going to do, because they know they're embarrassed too. They're reacting, but they can't react to something that's already on the book. So they got to put a different book cover on it. That's how it works. That's how it works. So, and I don't care what you do as long as it gets done. You know, you want to save face and not be embarrassed about it, I'm cool with that. There's no problem with that. However, as long as it gets done. If it gets done, we all good. So tune in this week. We're going to be talking about suffering for Christ versus suffering for sin. Is there a difference? So we're going to look at that. Peace. We'll talk soon. I may come on tonight, but tune in. Make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. Peace.